I've known Steve for a long time. He's been very active in the Wissahickon in growing plants for the Wissahickon, and he's very knowledgeable about the whole area. He has spoken to our garden group, I think about 6 or 8 months ago, on some of the plants in the Wissahickon. So it is my pleasure to introduce Steve Jones.
So the topic is 25 years of ecological restoration in the Wissahickon, and there's four basic things that I wanted to talk to you about that I hope that you find interesting. And actually, we were having a discussion about some of this when we were waiting for folks to gather. One of the things that I'm interested in is the idea that ecological restoration is a separate discipline, and although there are many plant-related or nature-related or ecology-related disciplines that are adjacent to it, it's developed its own identity. And our organization, Wissahickon Restoration Volunteers, has sort of been there during the birthing of that separate discipline. So I also want to talk to you a little bit about our organization's early days. We started in 1997, recently had our big 25th anniversary party. And then also I want to share with you some insights that we've developed in doing this ecological restoration work as it's done today. And then, of course, because I know you all are very active people and like to get involved in things, I want to give you some direction about how to get involved in restoration work, either directly or indirectly up here in the Northwest. So before I jump into all that, I just want to make sure everybody's hearing me okay and you're seeing the slides okay?
Fine.
Okay, so I got a thumbs up. I got a thumbs up from Hope. Okay, so I wanted to talk to you about this idea of ecological restoration as a separate discipline before we jump into the specifics of the Wissahickon. And it's so interesting to me to look back in retrospect and see how restoration ecology is kind of the convergence of these already existing disciplines. And one of those disciplines, I guess you'd describe as natural science. And this is the empirical science that had one of its important heydays in the 19th century. Philadelphia was a center of learning for that. And the Academy of Natural Sciences is one of those Philadelphia institutions that was really important, is still really important in the natural science aspect of restoration ecology. So the Patrick Center is one of the institutions that's part of the Academy. And one of the things that I noticed again in going back and reviewing the history of our restoration work over a quarter of a century is that the Academy of Natural Sciences keeps popping up. And all of the related disciplines that are aspects of restoration ecology. There are other disciplines that are closely related to what I call plant world. In other words, people who are involved professionally or as their passion in plants. And one of those that you may not be so familiar with is the design world. And I wanted to highlight this book that I have only become familiar with in the past 5 years or so that's called Design with Nature. And this book and a similar, much more recent book by Daryl Morrison are two examples of books in which the design world is inhabited by people who are experts in plants and plant ecology and have created a separate design discipline in which people's understanding of form and the human use of space is married together with understanding the way plants work. So right now, as we were just discussing before the talk, there's a lot of excitement in design world, in the garden world, as well as in the natural restoration world about integrating plants into human spaces. So that's another one of these contributing disciplines that relates to restoration ecology. So there is a international professional organization that is responsible for developing the discipline of ecological restoration, and that's called SER, the Society for Ecological Restoration. And this is really quite an amazing organization that is international in its scope, and combines together these separate natural history and design and horticulture disciplines into a common multidisciplinary effort. And sometimes we call it ecological restoration. Sometimes we call it restoration ecology. So here in Philadelphia, there's a regional affiliate of Society for Ecological Restoration that some of us who do this work, either as professionals or as volunteers, belong to. One of the really aspects of this multidisciplinary cauldron in Philadelphia is one particular design firm called Andropogon Associates. And one of the principals of that firm is named Leslie Sauer. And she has a book, she wrote a book some years ago called The Once and Future Forest that really was the first how-to textbook type treatment of how to do ecological restoration in a forest setting. And Carol was working for a landscape architecture firm. That's her training as a landscape architect, not as an ecologist, but was one of the people who was really important in introducing ecological concepts to the design world. And Carol is still really active today in forest restoration. And she's a friend of Wissahickon Restoration Volunteers and gives us a lot of good advice. And that's an example of this kind of interdisciplinary nature of the ecological restoration world. There are other disciplines, of course, that are what I would call restoration adjacent, that are important. And one of the ways that I become aware of how these disciplines have different attitudes, they have different bodies of knowledge, they have different conceptual tools, is that in doing work in the Wissahickon, you sometimes meet people who are affiliated with these different disciplines and actually observe how that discipline has a different take on how to do things compared to ecological restoration. So an example is horticulture. Philadelphia also, of course, is an important center of horticultural knowledge, has been for hundreds of years. The Pennsylvania Horticulture Society is headquartered in Philadelphia. I know a lot of arborists who practice arboriculture, which is yet another different discipline. And then, of course, there's the botany. There's the discipline of botany, which is mainly an observational discipline that concerns itself with understanding the natural distribution of plants in the world. So part of the fun to me, or the interest in doing ecological restoration, is this convergence of all these different plant-related disciplines that are overlap with each other to some extent, but also are separate from each other. So as for the work of our organization, this is an image of a map. I really love maps. And just to give you an idea of the scope of this restoration work that we do, I grabbed a screenshot of this map that helps people who are doing ecological restoration in the Northwest keep track of each other and not step on each other's toes and make sure we're aware of what everyone is doing. So all these little icons are just examples to give you like a rough idea of the distribution of the sites where ecological restoration happens in the Wissahickon Valley. And the green ones are WRV sites, and some of the blue ones are from the Parks and Recreation Department. The red ones are from Friends of the Wissahickon, and so on. So there's a lot of action in the Wissahickon related to ecological restoration, whatever that is, which we're gonna talk about. So our organization started, as I think I mentioned, in about 1997. This is a photo of our founder that I found in an article in the Philadelphia Inquirer from 1991. His name was Joe DeLugach, and and this gets to the V part of WRV, was a volunteer trained in the discipline of veterinary science. He was a vet, not in ecology, and was an example of one of these community scientists who grew up really loving the Wissahickon, understood that it was feeling the impacts of human disturbance, and decided to start an action-oriented program to try to reverse some of those disturbances. So there were basically three aspects of this early program. This was a little bit before my time. One was to act on the observation that a lot of the mature trees in the canopy of the Wissahickon were declining and not being reproduced. We're not reproducing themselves, and that some action really should be taken to restore that native tree canopy. There was also the observation that one of the stresses that the canopy trees were under was the growth of vines, most of them invasive exotic vines that had been introduced from people's yards or had been introduced by wildlife unintentionally into the Wissahickon. And then the other observation was that there were severe erosion problems all over the Wissahickon, some of which were related to the trail system, which in order to be more sustainable ought to be maintained and improved. So that was Joe's program, and people went to work on a volunteer basis, working with the landlord, which of course is the at the time was the Fairmount Park Commission. So what did we do? And this is sort of based on a simple observation about what some of the issues or problems were in the Wissahickon. One of the first things that happened was people found sources for trees that were native to the Wissahickon and installed them using volunteer labor. I think everybody is probably aware of the fact that the one of the pressures or negative impacts on the ecology of the Wissahickon is the overabundance of deer. So this adorable little spiral-shaped deer guard, as we call it, was intended to protect the baby trees from being rubbed or browsed by deer. And the hope was that they would survive long enough in order to reach maturity and be able to contribute to this missing canopy in the Wissahickon. From the very early days, there was identification of problem plants, in plants that were introduced from other ecosystems that had an invasive habit, meaning that this is a pretty plant, isn't it? I love this picture. This is a beautiful plant in the rose family. It was actually introduced to North America from elsewhere with a kind of good idea in mind, which is that as an alternative to fencing, people could use plants with thorns as a kind of living fence to constrain livestock. What could possibly go wrong? So what went wrong was that this plant proceeded to take resources from forested areas that prevented other plants from reproducing. So this is an example of a plant that's very, very common in the Wissahickon that establishes what we call monocultures, meaning populations of this plant where there's zero plant diversity and only the presence of the one species. So the early idea of Wissahickon Restoration Volunteers was to go after these plants and remove them. The reason I put remove in quotes is because I think we had a sort of a naive idea about what was involved in addressing the issue of invasive exotic plants, which we'll get to in a second. Another really important development at the beginning was this incredible effort funded with $26 million from the William Penn Foundation, which was to really apply all of the understandings of this emerging field of ecological restoration to a planning process for all of the natural areas in the Philadelphia, including the Wissahickon Valley Park, which at the time was part of the Fairmount Park system. So this massive study of the native ecology of the Wissahickon, and then also a master plan for implementation of restoration activities, was this incredibly groundbreaking piece of work. And it's the guide that is used by everyone, including the Fairmount Park Commission, the Friends of the Wissahickon, Wissahickon Restoration Volunteers, and so on, in doing restoration activities. So that is the really incredible achievement that was led by scientists from the Academy of Natural Sciences, and still provides a lot of the baseline guidance for how to do ecological restoration in the Wissahickon today. So pushing the clock forward a bit, our basic program of ecological restoration is pretty similar in a lot of ways compared to the past. But I wanted to just report to you a couple of ways in which our program has really developed a lot over the last quarter century or so. And then, as I say, in talking about the work we do, have hope that you might get interested in participating in some way. So if I could identify the two most basic differences or improvements in our work over this time, one is that we've done a much better job understanding the disciplines of forest ecology and ecological restoration and applying those ideas to our restoration work. And the second thing that we have done is recognize that not all communities are made to feel equally welcome in natural spaces or in doing work related to the environment. And that as an activist group, it's important for us to learn how to organize the entire community surrounding the natural area in support of natural spaces. So those are the two main areas, I think, where we've grown the most. So I don't want to go too far down into a rabbit hole or groundhog hole or whatever kind of wildlife hole in talking about restoration planning, but I do want to just point out to you some of the basic ways that we think about this planning and how we make our plans for restoration of natural spaces. So the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program is one example of learning that all of us can do to find out more about what is the state that natural spaces would be in without their disturbance. So this program is a coalition of several different state agencies that have expertise in understanding plant communities. And as I say, I think one of the things that we've done a better job in recent years is really understanding what we call reference forest types, which is to say, we try to learn about less disturbed forests and understand how they're structured, what their components are, and use that understanding as a basis for restoring our natural areas in urban settings. In other words, we're trying to address the question, restoration to what? And one of the ways we answer that question is by taking advantage of this really extensive empirical study of the composition of forests that are not as disturbed as our forests are. I know everybody loves a big long list of plants, but I just wanted to just give you a simple example of how we would use this understanding of forest ecology in our own planning. So one of the things that we learn is that forests come in types that are designated or named after their dominant species. So one of the forest types that we should be expecting to find in the natural areas in the Wissahickon, in the Piedmont section of eastern North America, is a red oak mixed hardwood forest. So once we understand something about the composition of that forest, we could ask ourselves, which of these trees that we normally would expect to find are there and which are missing. So examples of trees that we should be finding are red maple, various hickory trees, including mockernut hickory, tulip tree, which I think a lot of people are aware is definitely very common in the Wissahickon, and so on. And similarly, the other side of the coin is when we notice that some of these plants are missing from what should be a red oak mixed hardwood forest, those would be candidates for reintroduction. So one of the things that we've done recently that I think is a big improvement is that we're much more systematic in trying to understand what this forest would be like with less disturbance. Another aspect of that, by the way, though, is understanding what we call the structure of the forest. And when I say structure, I always use my hands like this. In other words, the other thing that we're understanding much better than we did at the beginning is that a forest is not only a set or a complement or a palette of plants. It also has a structure that it relies on in order to provide ecological services and functions. So a simple aspect of that is that an intact forest normally would have different layers or levels in which different types of wildlife are resident. So one of the things that we pay attention to is, does this forest have a canopy? Are there taller trees at the top? Does this forest have an understory, which is a kind of lower layer of woody plants? Does this forest have a forest floor where the herbaceous plants are able to reproduce? So in this shot right here, this is an example of a different forest community that we have in the Wissahickon, in the shadier parts and in north-facing steeper parts. It's the hemlock or white pine red oak mixed hardwood forest. And by studying this knowledge about the composition of forest types, we can get a better understanding of what's possibly missing. So in this one image here, somebody is planting a white pine, which is present in the Wissahickon, but in some areas is not as present as we might expect. And the one on the right, that's one of my favorites. This is a native azalea called pinkster flower that is present in very, very small numbers in the Wissahickon, but is an example of one of these shrub layer plants that would be in the lower woody layer of the forest, which is missing to a great extent in the Wissahickon because these plants have been browsed by deer. We have also developed a set of techniques thinking about the order in which forests recover from damage. And an example of that would be thinking about whether in what order we introduce the slower growing shade tolerant trees like the oaks versus the faster growing shade intolerant trees like the birches. And that thinking about that goes into our planning. One of the things that you might notice about some of these plant pictures that I'm showing is that there are these pieces of wire near them. And another aspect of our work is really understanding how to install these diverse plants into the Wissahickon and to protect them from the overpopulation of deer. So you might remember I showed you an image of a little plastic a spiral on one stem. And what we've moved to based on experience is the installation of these wire deer guards that are 48 inches around and have these 2-inch by 4-inch gaps in them that discourage the deer from browsing them and also allow the plant to grow both at the same time. I was telling people before we started that this is my favorite series of photos that I have. For some reason I really like pictures of people building deer guards, and especially like whacking the stakes that hold them up with a mallet. So this is just foreshadowing a little bit what it's like to volunteer with us. An example of what we do when we're acting on these restoration plans is installing these special structures that that give the plants a better chance to resist the pressure from the deer, whether it's browsing or rubbing. Here's another aspect of what we do in this restoration work that is a little bit different from the way we first envisaged it 25 years ago. And that is that we're much more focused on seeing what we can do to allow the site to recover itself. I think part of what we've learned is a little bit of humility, which is to say that the efforts that we make should be a contribution toward a damaged forest recovering itself from some kind of disturbance. But the work that we do is only a part of getting that site on a trajectory of recovery. So one of the things that we tried to focus on is allowing the site to recover itself and not try to control every aspect of the restoration. So these two plants that I just showed you are examples of plants that are in one of our restoration sites. We didn't plant them, but what we did was we made sure that we didn't disturb them while we were busy, digging holes and restoring some of the woody plants that were missing from that site. So the second thing that I think is really important in our work that's more developed than it was at the beginning is organizing everybody into doing this restoration work. And that's not to say that there were, never people from different ages or never people of color, in addition to people from European backgrounds participating in this work. But it is to say that we do have a history in our country of study of the natural world and access to the natural world. I hope you're oh yeah, and access to the natural world not being equally shared by everybody. So that's one of the things that our organization is working on in the V part, in the volunteer part. And so I guess I feel like I've had a lot of really positive experiences in this regard that I'd just like to share with you. And part of that experience is going to institutions that don't necessarily see themselves as mainly focused on ecology, but simply people who are open to or interested in doing this restoration work and coming to them instead of waiting for those folks to come to us. So one of the early lessons I got in that is when I was teaching at Community College of Philadelphia. I developed a long-time relationship with a colleague who taught environmental science, and we always worked in a coalition to bring folks to the Wissahickon to learn about ecological restoration. So as you can see, this is a really sweet group of people. They look just a little bit grouchy because it was early, cold, and raining slightly. But this is a group of folks that is very representative of the student body at Community College of Philadelphia, not so representative of the body of a lot of groups that are in the restoration world or in the ecology world. So that's one of the things that WRV does to try to make sure that the whole community is out there in support of these spaces. The other thing that's happening right now that I find really exciting is that organizations specifically geared toward or organized by people of color are getting interested in getting out and involved in nature and doing activities including ecological restoration. So in the last couple of years, as an example, WRV has made friends with a group called Latino Outdoors, which is a national group and has affiliate. And they have a really simple mission, which is really wonderful, which is to get people who identify as Latino out in nature, walking around, enjoying themselves. So we're pushing that relationship a little bit farther, and we've instituted so far a guided hike that we did last year, where people were encouraged to learn how to or develop their ability to talk about the natural world in Spanish, as well as English. And this year, that group is going to be doing another natural history hike with us, and also one of their own volunteer days where people from Latino Outdoors come and work with us. There are other ways too that we've really developed over the years, what I call stewardship communities. And one of the amazing things about this is that it's not always planned. So it would not have occurred to me that this was going to be one way that we develop stewardship communities. But in WRV, we have two pretty major projects that were created in honor of someone who died. And the family members, as part of the process, both of grieving and also of honoring their loved one, worked with us to develop a plan for the restoration of a particular site, so that they could do this work in honor of a loved one. So this is an example of folks getting ready to do restoration work near historic Rittenhouse Town, and that's Mindy Maslin from PHS and her husband Sid Ozer, who and their son Sam was killed because of traffic violence on Henry Avenue about 4 years ago, and they have since then worked with us on this project that is open to everyone, but is specifically geared toward stewardship in honor of their son, Sam. And as I say, this isn't an example of a program that I would have just thought of on my own, but is another example of a stewardship community that kind of like developed organically. I guess organically is the right word. So those communities are another example of how we've tried to expand the scope of who gets involved in ecological restoration. Another great thing that's happening that we're taking advantage of is this incredible enthusiasm for community science that's happening right now, sometimes assisted by technology. So this is the intrepid group of participants in last year's City Nature Challenge, which is a sort of half-hearted but enjoyable competition between cities all over the world to try to document the greatest number of species all on the same weekend. So this is part of the Philadelphia team that we helped to organize in the Wissahickon. And the way this worked was that folks made observations using iNaturalist app to record their species that they had documented during that special weekend. So just wanted to say a little bit more about some of these lessons that we've learned over time. This is a photograph. Thank you for the note about identifying plants. This is a spot near the Walnut Lane Golf Course, close to Roxborough Avenue in Roxborough. And even though the plant in front is out of focus, I really like this picture because it shows this incredible expanse of trout lily, Erythronium americanum, reaching up a hillside. And this is actually near one of our restoration sites, but we didn't do anything to restore this site. One of the things that I think we've seen is that it's much easier to protect undisturbed sites than it is to restore disturbed sites. And one of the reasons for that is because there's so many forms of disturbance that take place that we don't even really fully understand. So we would be much, much better off identifying little spots like this. Actually, it looks a lot like Hope's backyard. Identifying spots like this in the Wissahickon, whatever is growing in them, and protect them from disturbance, so that we don't have to go through this somewhat artificial process of restoration. And sort of related to that, I also wanted to mention another kind of like new area of activity that's exciting for us, and that's learning about the underground community of organisms in forests. So I don't know if anybody recognizes this person. This is Merlin Sheldrake, who's, we can't all be Steve Jones, who's got really an incredible name, and also is one of the folks that is making the study of fungi and mushrooms really popular right now. And so one of the things that we're starting to learn in trying to understand the success or the lack of success of our projects is what's going on in the underground biome. So as an example, WRV this year is working with a soil scientist and a couple of other advisors to design some experiments where we reintroduce carbon in the form of wood chips to our restoration sites and do studies where we compare how well the underground biome is developing in these two different sites. The idea is that we haven't paid enough attention to the contribution of the underground biome, the soil biome, including the mycorrhizal fungi, in the development of plants. And we're hoping that if we learn more about how to help that underground biome recover, this will also assist in the recovery of the plants themselves that are so important in those ecosystems. So does it work? I'm going to say yes. So I'm going to show you a couple of before and after pictures. This is a site along an edge in Wigard Avenue. This picture was taken in 2011. And this is a place where we were trying to do a project where we were protecting the edge of a forest to try to prevent a invasive species from getting a really strong foothold. That's what it looked like in 2011. And this is not a super recent picture, but that's what this exact same spot looked like 5 years later. So it is really encouraging to see that this really does work. And although we're not restoring these forests to the state that they were in pre-disturbance, you can see that some of these criteria that we're looking for, like a canopy and an understory and more species diversity, do develop in the sites where we've worked. Here's another example. This is along Kitchens Lane in Mount Airy. And this is one of our earlier projects from 2004, 20 years ago now. And we were planting along a roadside, again, with the idea of protecting the interior of a forest from disturbance. And that's the same site in 2020. And by the way, speaking of individual plants, Virginia knotweed is the plant that is growing on the forest floor there. That's one of the few floor habitat plants that persists in the Wissahickon pretty regularly. That's another example of a plant that we didn't plant, but we simply got out of its way and created circumstances for it to grow. And now it's contributing to this forest floor community. You can see that the trees that we planted with those little deer guards have, some of them have reached maturity, and they're throwing shade and providing all kinds of ecological services, including lowering the temperature in that forest, which also improves water quality, preventing erosion, and so on. So I think it is fair to say that it works. So what you say? Is it possible for you to get involved in doing this restoration work? Definitely yes. So I put a couple of links here, and I did share with folks all of these slides if for some reason you want to take a look at them later. You can do ecological restoration work by volunteering with us, Wissahickon Restoration Volunteers. The Fairmount Park Conservancy also organizes volunteer groups in support of natural areas and community parks through the Love Your Park program. And you can also go to their events page. And then Friends of the Wissahickon, which is the main friends group in the Wissahickon that does a lot of different kinds of activity, does include in its activities restoration work, and that's also available on their events page as well. Supposing, however, you're not necessarily so interested in going out into the woods and planting trees and shrubs and putting deer guards around baby trees and so on, there are also things that you can do even in your own yards without leaving your apartment or house to contribute to ecological restoration. And mainly the way that you can do that is through using plants that are native to eastern Pennsylvania in your own plantings, and avoiding plants that are invasive in the Wissahickon and in other natural areas. There's a lot of talk about that right now. There's a lot of great writing. I would point you to the first big book about this by Doug Ptolemy called Bringing Nature Home. The subtitle is How Native Plants Sustain Wildlife in Our Gardens. And Doug Ptolemy also has now a national program that he calls Homegrown National Park, where he's encouraging people to think about some of these ecological restoration concepts in managing their own spaces. And that's another way that you can contribute to ecological restoration without leaving your own space at home. So that's what I wanted to say, folks. And I'm happy to talk to you and hear what you have to say.
Hope you have to unmute.
Everybody can unmute themselves, and Steve is happy to take questions.
I have a question about Carpenter Woods. Is it part of the Wissahickon?
Yeah, and so there's a little stream at the bottom of Carpenter Woods called Carpenter's Run, and it is a tributary to the Wissahickon Creek. So looking at the Wissahickon from a watershed perspective, that's one of the little sub watersheds that's a component. And then just organizationally, yeah, it's considered to be part of the Wissahickon. Carpenter's Woods, maybe somebody here knows more about this than I do. Carpenter's Woods has its own friends group called Friends of Carpenter's Woods. And I thought it might come up tonight, and I went and I looked at their website, which hasn't been updated in a while. So I'm not 100% sure how active they are. But that is a group where that's a component of the Wissahickon. But I think we all should maybe if we live near there, try to find out whether that group is still active or not. I wasn't able to find out.
Is there, or was there at any point a major inventory of all the plants in the Wissahickon before you started?
Yeah. And there was the Academy of Natural Sciences botanists did a biological inventory of the Wissahickon as part of the NALREAP master plan. They started actually in 1997. So that's available in the NALREAP plan. And also there was a separate, fairly recent inventory of trees by Professor Fogg, who was a professor at University of Pennsylvania and also active in one of the big arboretums. I forget which one.
Forest.
Thank you. So that checklist, he has a checklist which he doesn't claim to be 100% complete, but he has a checklist that's also pre-restoration.
You had shown a picture of Virginia knotweed. Is that related to the Japanese knotweed?
As I'm so fond of saying, this is evidence that Pangea is real. So the answer is yes. And they are pretty closely related to each other. And Japanese knotweed is native to Japan. And Virginia knotweed, as we call it, it's not in the same genus, but they are pretty closely related to each other. So they have, they have a common ancestor.
So why is the Virginia knotweed? You seem to think that that's preferable. Why so?
Yeah, right. Oh, yeah, that's such an interesting question. Thank you. So plants that have evolved in other systems have certain advantages when they're introduced into new ecological settings. One of those is that the usual things that eat them are not present, or maybe some of the other challenges that they experience are not present in that new system. So that's definitely true of Japanese knotweed, which is not a bad plant. I mean, I feel bad when people kind of like start hating, hating plants. The plants are not trying to do anything; they're just trying to live. But Japanese knotweed does create really severe disturbance in the Wissahickon, and I think the thinking about that is that it's not missing the organisms that eat its leaves. It's not missing the plants that compete with it for resources and so on. And so it establishes these monocultures. The difference with Virginia knotweed is that it's been living in a community with other organisms here for at least since the last ice age, 10 or 11,000 years. And so organisms have worked out relationships where there's less dominance of one species over the others.
Okay.
So you leave it alone? The Virginia?
Yeah, we love it. We love it. It's funny, like putting on your horticulture hat. If you had a lot of this in your yard, you might think, oh, it's kind of weedy, right? Because it's once it gets established, it tends to establish itself pretty well. But one of the advantages, and I really would encourage folks to learn about this Doug Ptolemy material if you haven't yet. One of the advantages of the native plants is that they're hosts for native insects, and not just the adult forms, the charismatic adult forms of insects like the butterflies and so on, but also the larval stages. So one of the advantages of the native plants, both in natural areas and also in our yards, is that they're hosts for these beneficial insects that eat their leaves in their larval stage. one of the big insights from this work on that Doug Ptolemy has been doing is that exotic plants can't be consumed by the local insects, and so therefore they don't have that wildlife value. So the answer is yes, we really like it. It's contributing that way, and then also it's one of the few native plants that you'll see that's persisting on the forest floor. I've never tasted it, but I assume the reason is that it doesn't taste good to deer. That's usually the reason why we have plants persisting in the Wissahickon, that they don't taste good.
Steve?
Yeah.
I've been battling Japanese knotweed for 20 years on certain. Can I just start
How's it
calling
going?
Virginia? Can I call it Virginia knotweed now and leave it alone?
Start eating it.
You could just change your attitude. Yes, there's people are working on recipes. I volunteer a lot at Historic Rittenhouse Town, and I think this year we're going to try to make paper out of it.
But I've seen it being sold in Rittenhouse Square at the market.
Oh,
The little shoots, the little shoots.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it is edible.
I've got a friend, my friend Mindy, whose picture you saw, is learning how to make pie out of it, kind of like along the lines of rhubarb pie. So because the knotweed fibers on the shoots are a lot like rhubarb, and you put strawberry in there, and good to go. We've actually had knotweed pie during one of our snack breaks.
Okay.
Karen,
I had a question. I'm also about lawns and reseeding lawns with bee-friendly plants. Have you encountered any major projects in this area where people have done that?
So
low-growing plants.
Yeah, so I'm going to put on my other hat. The reason I'm so interested in this topic of okay, Wanda, thank you. Nice to see you, Wanda. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Take care.
Okay. Yeah, one of the reasons I'm so interested in these disciplines is that, I do botany with the Philadelphia Botanical Club, and that's basically looking at things. I do horticulture with LandHealth Institute, where I manage a plant nursery, and I do restoration with WRV, and they're all like, it's so interesting to me that they're all kind of different. So putting on my horticulture hat for a minute, it's a growing trend that I'm involved in. Not necessarily completely eliminating yards, but one bit at a time, replacing the traditional lawn with a complement of native plants. And it's very doable. In some places, I guess in a lot of the Northwest, actually, you still would have deer pressure. It depends where you live. I mean, the deer don't like to cross Chelton Avenue where I am, so we don't have deer. But it's very doable, and among the advantages are the attraction of a bigger diversity of insects, and some of them are really cool looking.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm trying to do that with the front lawn in our property, and Primex is now carrying bee-friendly lawn seeds.
Yeah. Bees. So the thing about bees to be aware of, again, we'll put on different hats, is the huge majority of bee species in our area are native bees that most of us have probably never noticed before. And they, contribute to the ecology through their relationship with the other organisms, including the plants. And a lot of them are like little teeny tiny, little jobs, and they're really fascinating. So contributing to their well-being would be a reason to include, various native plants in your plantings. The other thing that people mean when they say bee, though, however, is they're talking about honeybees, which is a slightly different issue because this really basically relates to agriculture. right? The bees that produce honey
Mm.
are introduced from Europe. They, of course, they're all over the place in natural systems in this part of the world. And issues with honeybees are really more issues of the human food system than they are of natural systems. So, I mean, I like to eat. Most of the people that I know like to eat. So, from that perspective, I'm, concerned about honeybees. That's not really an ecological restoration issue, since the role of honeybees is in agriculture
Agriculture.
as opposed to,
Yeah.
yeah. Mhm. Yeah. So when they say bee friendly, I mean, Primex is they're a great company. And when they say bee friendly, they're, probably, trying to get involved in one of the topics of discussion, about this stuff, and some of which is about native bees and some of which is about bees as honey producers. And also pollinators of introduced vegetable crops. So, yeah.
But this was leading into in
Karen-
the Wissahickon, is it
I think
possible?
Karen is.
Oh,
Karen
I'm
wants
sorry.
to add
Yeah, I
something,
think Karen was going to say something before. Yeah.
Well, I did have a comment and a question. I was interested when you said that the Wissahickon used to be part of the Fairmount Park Commission, but it sounded like you said at some point it stopped being part of the Fairmount Park. Does that mean it's not part of the Fairmount Park, whole Fairmount Park system? Or I mean, what does it mean exactly? And how long ago was it? And has it been beneficial to the restoration of the Wissahickon?
Oh, right. Great question. Okay, I'll try to give a succinct answer to that without getting into too much, organizational stuff. Yeah. So the Fairmount Park Commission is such an interesting creature. It's one of these, 19th century Victorian creatures, and it had its advantages and disadvantages as a steward of the park system. Several years ago, it was abolished, and as part of the process of combining the parks department with the recreation department. So now in Philadelphia, and this is fairly recent, we have a Department of Parks and Recreation. And part of what was happening was the sort of like the cliche aspect of this was people noticed that, thank you, Jim. People noticed that the parks department, the parks people had a set of lawnmowers, and the recreation people had a set of lawnmowers, and there was, two garages and two sets of lawnmowers, and like, why are we, reproducing all this infrastructure? So the two, the people that are in charge of the rec centers and the people that are in charge of the parks, including the natural areas, were combined together. So as part of that process, the Wissahickon is no longer part of what we used to call Fairmount Park, which began in the 1800s, starting with Lemon Hill, closer to Center City. Although it is a component, and although it has kind of an autonomous existence, it is a component of the lands that are managed by the Philadelphia Department of Parks and Recreation. So Parks and Rec is still the overall body that's responsible for managing the natural areas and the recreation centers. So there's still that unified structure that takes care of the Wissahickon, along with other natural areas like Pennypack and FDR and so on. So was it beneficial? I would say really the bigger issue is the lack of funding for any of these things, no matter what you call them. Philadelphia is one of the poorest funded park systems in the United States, which is amazing considering the incredible resources that we have. So on a per capita basis, we're really close to the bottom. And that was not addressed in the creation of this new department. Now, there's a possibility that that's going to change because of this new grant funding for the rebuild project that is managed by the city. So new millions of dollars are going to be infused into all the parks, including the rec centers. So I think it's not so much moving around the little organizational parts that's important, but it's putting the resources in that really makes the biggest difference. So I'd like, really in a way, Wissahickon Restoration Volunteers probably shouldn't exist. I think the only reason we exist is because the public resources don't exist to do what should be done. Like this work that we're doing, really, it's good in a way. It keeps me out of trouble, but in a more rational system, I think would be funded and operated by, not by a little, independent nonprofit like us, but by by city agency, that's properly funded.
So it hasn't changed a lot. It could if there's more resources, but
Yeah. And it hasn't. I would say it hasn't changed a lot. I'm hoping that it's going to change. A simple example is that the number of arborists that work in the city of Philadelphia. I mean, I think there's a handful of professional arborists that work for the city, and keeping up. I mean, there's 1,800 acres or so of natural areas just in the Wissahickon, let alone East Park, let alone Pennypack, so I guess the jury is out on whether this reorganization was really helpful or not, but I think I know I'm repeating myself. I think it's the funding that's the main issue. Yeah.
Do you have a favorite area that's being focused on these days for restoration?
Area, you mean like physical geographic area or area
Yes.
of activity?
No, I meant geographic.
Yeah. So, yeah, I do actually. So, there is an area near historic Rittenhouse Town and Bluebell Field. You folks know where Bluebell is? I know some of you live pretty close to there. Yeah. Yeah. So there's an area near there that is really interesting to me because it's got a really great, it's got an example of what we call a reference forest. It's got like a pretty intact forest that's got a lot of diversity. There's not too many invasive plants. And it's really cool. And it's on the Orange Trail. And so we've been studying it. I actually have an intern from Haverford College who's doing her senior thesis project on our restoration work. And so she's been available to help us with some of our data collection. And so we've been studying this cool little reference forest and understanding what's going on in there. And right next to it, right around the bend, is a forest that's very, very disturbed. And it's just dominated by invasive plants. And it kind of backs up onto Bluebell Field, where the little ball fields are. So I'm really taken with that area right now, because it's fun to see what it could be like if it was less disturbed. And we're going to be bringing a bunch of volunteers to do restoration in there this year. This fall, we're going to be hosting a Sierra Club service trip. I don't know if you know about the like week-long service trips that Sierra Club does. Yeah, so we're going to be hosting a group of folks that are going to be staying at Chamonix Mansion and volunteering with us during the day. And I picked like a really challenging spot there behind Bluebell because those people are like, they like to work. So that's my favorite spot right now because it's, it's kind of, the more nobody wants to go for a walk with me. 'Cause like, the more you become aware of these things, the more kind of depressed you get because everything's like, oh, that's bad. This is disturbed. But walk around the corner of this little site and you see hickories and you see some plants growing on the floor and so on. So it's cool.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's
Steve, I just wanted to say some of us have limitations because we are a senior group, but
Yes.
definitely be advocates for our parks. They are such a vital resource in this city. You can find all kinds of people when you take a walk along the Forbidden Drive in Valley Green. So advocating is one thing we can do.
I really agree with you. We can do that. And then also this thing, not everybody has a big garden, but also this topic of, how we work with plants in our own spaces is really important too. Even if it's just a container or if it's a little shady spot in your backyard, choosing plants that could potentially contribute to the ecology is something that people can do too, even if you're, not up for volunteering.
Are there any more questions, comments? I remember days when I could walk in the Wissahickon and there was trailing arbutus. I have not seen that in years. I wonder how many other plants have disappeared from that area.
Yeah. Well, I can show you. It's funny, in plant world, everybody knows like all the little secret places where, oh yeah, there's some trilliums over there, right? You know about that? Yeah, I know about that. Don't tell anybody. but yeah, main point is right. A lot of these plants that are more sensitive are hanging on by a thread, and we are never going to bring back trailing arbutus by planting it. So that was one of my other points too, is that it's much more important to protect some of these intact areas, because we're never going to figure out how to get the toothpaste back in the tube after we disturb the sensitive areas.
Thank you very much. It was really a fascinating talk, and
Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me. I
you.
appreciate
sure
it.
people will be looking at it on the recording. To go back
Yeah, they
over
can
it
catch all the mistakes and stuff.
Thank you very much again, Steve.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you.